Melina had woken up with the first light of morning. The day, as usual, had begun in a rush. For her, work was becoming more complicated with each passing day. She had only been at her new job in Istanbul for a few weeks, but it felt like the days were chasing one another relentlessly. This morning, too, was one where she had to prepare for several important presentations. She got dressed quickly, made her coffee while watching the minutes tick by swiftly, and realized she needed to leave the house as soon as possible. Hurrying to get to work, she found herself stuck in traffic with her old car. The minutes spent on the road felt like an hour to her. She had prepared meticulously to make a good impression, but the city's chaos and morning traffic left her, as always, grappling with stress. Still, she finally made it to the office. She stepped inside, not yet feeling the weight of that day's meeting on her shoulders. The moment she entered, she noticed the office's bustling energy. Everyone was busy at their computers, surrounded by desks cluttered with papers, working in a frantic rush. As Melina closed the office door behind her, a loud exclamation suddenly rang out. "Oh my God!" Instinctively, she jerked her head around, still clutching her coffee. Everything happened in an instant. Her coffee spilled all over the man standing right in front of her. Red coffee stains marred his stylish suit. Melina's eyes widened in shock as she met the man's stunned and furious gaze. "What have you done?" he said, his voice a mix of mockery and irritation. Melina froze, utterly speechless. She understood what had happened right away but hadn't expected it to be taken so seriously. The coffee spilled on the man had turned into an instant disaster. "I'm so sorry," she mumbled, quickly leaning toward him. "I didn't mean to do that." The man grimaced, took a deep breath, and as he looked at Melina, his eyes burned with resentment. "You may not have meant it, but the results are clear. Now what are we going to do?" Melina noticed his frustrated expression, the furrowed brows and the anger etched on his face. Yet beneath the fury in his eyes, there was also a hint of bewilderment. "Please, let me find a solution. I can clean it up right away," she said, quickly scanning her surroundings. "Are you planning to clean my suit?" he retorted sharply, casting a hard look at her. "Come on, you can't possibly be that quick. Today's already a complete disaster." Melina wanted to sink into the floor from embarrassment, but just then the security guard at the front of the office stepped forward. Shaking his head, he said, "Excuse me, sir. Is there anything we can assist you with?" The man seemed to calm down slightly. With a slight nod, he replied, "Everything's fine, but this woman needs to clean this up immediately. This outfit cost a few $100s. His eyes didn't leave Melina as he spoke. Melina quickly called the cleaning service staff nearby, asking them to wipe the coffee stain off the man's suit. It was clear there wasn't much else she could do. She stepped back, trying to compose herself, though a wave of unease washed over her at the thought that this could spiral into a catastrophe. Caught between the man's angry glares, Melina began to feel the tension rise, the complete opposite of the relief she'd felt moments ago when she'd first walked in. Events had unfolded so rapidly that she couldn't comprehend how she'd ended up in this situation. Thankfully, the man calmed down a bit more and accepted her quick solution. But for her, this was just the beginning. And that beginning would impact her life in ways no one could have predicted. For hours after the coffee incident, only one person occupied Melina's mind: Damien King. Who was this man? Why had she been so frantic to clean the coffee off him and find a solution? Despite all the chaos, his anger toward her seemed to simmer just beneath his body language. There was something behind the stern expression on his face, but Melina couldn't quite figure it out. The truth was this: after the coffee mishap, Melina had begun to discover who Damien King was, and just how important he truly was. That afternoon, as Melina turned to head back to the office, she received a message from Damien's office. "I hear you've been working late again, which is good. But this time be prepared. You'll be doing a presentation with me this afternoon." Melina took a deep breath and put her phone away. This was the first major task Damien had given her. It was far more than just a coffee spill. It was a job. The uncertainty and fear swirling in her mind gave way to a resolve to take a step forward. After reading Damien's message, Melina had left the morning's chaos behind. The uncertainty and tension within her had morphed into a mix of excitement and fear. This wasn't just about a coffee spill anymore. It was an opportunity that could change her life. Her mind buzzed with hundreds of questions. Who was Damien King? What had made him so angry? She had never encountered someone like him before. The people around her were usually warm and easygoing, but Damien was harsh and distant. At that moment, she was trying to find a way to understand this man who seemed to carry a cloud of anger above him. When she arrived at the office, everyone was going about their work as usual. But for Melina, this mysterious pull made it impossible for things to feel normal. Though she tried to forget Damien's stern looks and sharp tone, his image grew clearer in her mind. She struggled to make sense of these feelings. She was a professional woman, meant to steer clear of emotional turmoil. Yet somehow Damien stirred a strange attraction in her. It was evident that this feeling carried a deeper meaning than a mere morning mishap. As the afternoon wore on, a file was placed on Melina's desk. Damien's name was written on it. She felt a twinge of unease as she opened it. Inside were details of an important presentation and meeting, complete with Damien's signature at the top, a sign that he was taking her seriously. She dove into her work, knowing every detail of the presentation she'd delivered to Damien had to be perfect. An hour later, a call came from Damien's office. Melina picked up the phone, taking a deep breath. "Yes, sir," she answered. "Are you ready for our meeting?" Damien's voice came through, cold yet tinged with a mocking edge. "Yes, I'll be right there," Melina replied, trying to ease her nerves. Stepping into the room, she saw Damien seated at his desk. His face was expressionless, but the sharp look in his eyes suggested something wasn't quite right. Melina moved toward the meeting room with careful, patient steps, more cautious than ever. "You're right on time," Damien said, glancing at her briefly. "Let's get started." As Melina spread the documents across the table, Damien's eyes didn't leave her for a moment. In that instant she sensed something shifting in his gaze. Unlike his earlier icy demeanor, there was now something else in his eyes, perhaps a hidden spark of interest? Before she could decipher it, she launched into her presentation. During the presentation, Melina knew she had to prove herself to Damien. She brought together every ounce of her skill, experience, and professionalism to deliver it. Her greatest fear was that Damien would once again adopt a dismissive attitude toward her. But with each passing minute, she felt herself sinking with him more naturally. Damien watched closely. At times he glanced at his papers or jotted notes, but his focus remained steadily on Melina. She was aware of his scrutiny, though she did her best not to let it distract her. Still, with every second she felt the weight of his attention and piercing gaze. When the presentation ended, Damien leaned back in his chair silently. For a few seconds he simply looked at her, then spoke slowly. "Much better than I expected," he said, his eyes carrying a meaning she couldn't fully unravel. "Yes, I approve this presentation. But your work shouldn't stop here." Melina nodded, a little tense. Meaning someone like you could achieve things beyond this office," Damien replied, his voice dropping lower. "I've noticed it's easy to work with you." Melina tried to piece together what his words meant. Damien seemed to inject a slightly emotional tone into the conversation, but there was something beneath it. On one hand, she still recalled his angry glares and stern demeanor. On the other, there were hints he might be intrigued by her. As he wrapped up the meeting, Damien added, "There's more work ahead. Next week you'll join me for some important meetings. I expect a lot from you, Melina. But I know you're ready for it." After those words, Melina wasn't sure how to feel. She found herself wrapped in a mix of triumph and apprehension. This rapidly evolving dynamic and tangled attraction were pulling her into an entirely new world. No matter how professional she tried to remain, her connection with Damien grew more complex by the day. After all these events, the only thing on Melina's mind was the mysterious pull Damien exerted over her and the emotions that would come with spending more time with him. This job was no longer just a task. It was turning into a passion. In the days following the presentation, as Melina began to learn more about Damien, she struggled to manage the whirlwind of emotions inside her. His cold and distant demeanor had initially intimidated her, But as time passed, Damien's enigmatic side started to draw her in. This attraction made it difficult for either of them to step toward the feelings they both kept hidden. A week later, she received another message from Damien's office. "You can see me at 5 this afternoon. Also, I'd like you to have the weekly report ready." Melina took a deep breath after reading the message. The past few days had been consumed with completing tasks, but Damien's complex attitude toward her was making things harder. No matter how close she got to him, Melina always held herself back a step. She was still trying to unravel what lay behind his icy behavior. One thing was certain: the air around Damien pulled her in, yet it frightened her at the same time. When she stepped inside, Damien wasn't at his desk this time. The office was as orderly as it had been in previous days, but Melina couldn't shake the feeling that something was brewing beneath his silence. A few seconds later, Damien entered, stepping in from the large windows where he'd been gazing outside. "Melina," he said, her name falling from his lips with that same chilly tone. "Have you prepared the report?" "Yes, sir," Melina replied, summoning her courage and placing the file on the desk. As she presented the report, Damien's eyes were fixed on it, but watching him made Melina feel strangely uneasy. His impassive face stirred in her a mix of fear and an odd attraction. When Damien finished reviewing the report and set it down, he said, "You've done good work. But there are still some things missing." His gaze didn't waver from her. "You're not just here to do tasks. There should be more meaning to your presence. Don't forget you're the assistant to the company's CEO." Melina's mind raced, searching for the meaning behind his words. Damien was always pushing her to focus on her work, drawing clear personal boundaries. Yet every time his piercing looks and mocking smiles made her feel both drawn to him and compelled to pull away. A silence settled between them. As Melina stared at Damien's desk, something made the moment even more strained. Damien kept looking at her intently, his eyes unwavering. She tried to decipher the emotion beneath his gaze, but she always stayed one step behind. "Are you listening to me?" Damien asked, his tone edged with tension. Melina snapped herself together. "Yes, I'm listening," she said, slightly startled. "But I don't think being so distant makes our work any easier." Damien paused, studying her carefully before softening a little. "Sometimes distance keeps people focused on their jobs. Personal matters shouldn't interfere." Melina felt he didn't understand her. "But aren't we human too? Building an effective working relationship might be hard without getting to know each other." Damien considered this for a moment, then gave a faint smile, one that carried no warmth. "Our job is just business. We don't need to know each other." For a moment, something inside Melina cracked. Damien's cold approach always left her feeling excluded. Yet from another angle, she sensed there was more beneath his stern attitude. It was as if he was drawing a line he didn't want her to cross. When Melina locked eyes with Damien one last time, a new feeling stirred within her. This was about more than a professional relationship. It was tied to the growing pull between them. But neither could muster the courage to breach their emotional walls. "The more we talk about this, the more things will change," Damien said, a hint of pessimism in his voice. "But for now, I shouldn't waste any more time with you." Stepping closer, Melina replied with a touch of boldness, "Fine. But don't forget, emotions can be strong enough not to just hinder our work." Damien's eyes flickered with a shift, but he didn't respond. His wordless gaze kept Melina's confusion swirling a little longer. In that moment, she realized once again how difficult it was to understand Damien's inner world or untangle their working relationship. Melina was grappling with the emotional weight her relationship with Damien brought. It was no longer just about work. There was an emotional distance between them too. Over the past few days, she'd been constantly questioning this dynamic in her mind, trying to decipher every move and glance from Damien. She was caught between the attraction she felt for him and his distant, cold demeanor. One morning, she received a new assignment from Damien. It was both an opportunity to test her abilities and a step that would push the boundaries of their relationship even further with each passing day. As Melina walked toward Damien's office, her heart beat faster than usual. She wasn't sure how much longer she could work with someone so detached. But one thing was clear. Damien's behavior only made him more intriguing. His coldness created a pull that was the opposite of what it should have been. She wanted to get closer to him, yet she also tried to maintain that distance. Damien was seated at his desk, his eyes fixed on the computer screen, lost among stacks of papers. When Melina entered, he spoke without looking up, his voice carrying its usual detached tone. "You're here, Melina," he said. "Today we'll go over some important files. But first, we need to talk." Melina noticed that nothing could be read in Damien's eyes. His cold gaze blocked her from seeing what lay beneath. "What would you like to talk about?" she asked, a faint tremor of unease in her voice. "For starters, you need to learn to trust me," Damien said, sitting up straight at his desk. "When you're working here, it's just about the work. Emotions disrupt professionalism. Don't forget that." Inwardly, Melina resisted his words. On one hand, she thought he might be right. Emotions had always complicated things. On the other, she believed such a cold and rigid approach pushed people apart rather than bringing them together. And perhaps that was why her attraction to him was growing so tangled. "I understand," Melina said, summoning a bit of courage. "But aren't you human too? Instead of suppressing your emotions, couldn't you learn to deal with them?" Damien lifted his head and looked at her intently. For a moment, his eyes held a flicker of surprise, as if he'd never seen her this way before. But soon after, his cold demeanor returned. "There's no place for emotions in business, Melina. Personal attachments can't come before the job." With those words, Melina sensed once again that there was a deep wound inside Damien. For someone to be this unyielding, they must have endured a significant trauma in their past. Yet she didn't dare bring it up. Perhaps it wasn't the right time. A silence settled over the room for a few seconds. Melina longed to see the experiences hidden in Damien's eyes, but she couldn't muster the courage to ask what had happened to him. Still, she realized something. His stern and distant attitude, while making him seem cold and inflexible, was also a shield to protect himself. After working for a while longer, Damien set the reports on the desk and said, "All right, let's review these." As Melina went through the reports, she began to appreciate Damien's perfectionism even more. He truly was a visionary. He wanted everything to be flawless, and that was the foundation of his success. But at the same time, she couldn't help wondering if this approach left him isolated. Midway through the presentation, Damien seemed to relax slightly. The shadows of his past in his eyes caught Melina's attention. On one hand, he was determined to maintain a professional relationship. On the other, Melina wanted to get closer to him. But approaching Damien and breaking through his inner barriers would be a major test for both of them. At the end of the presentation, Melina noticed something. Damien's emotional walls, built around his professionalism, clashed with the interest he seemed to subtly convey. Sometimes he'd look into her eyes only to quickly glance away. Deciphering the meaning in his gaze was nearly impossible. As Melina quietly returned to her computer, Damien's looks lingered in her mind. Everything carried emotional undertones while they both tried to stay professional. On one side, Damien appeared distant and stern. On the other, beneath that tough exterior, there was a hidden attraction. Melina felt the confusion within her grow with every minute she spent with Damien. Their relationship was no longer just about work. It had become an emotional battlefield. Every move, every glance tested their boundaries while simultaneously complicating their dynamic. Yet at some point, Melina realized there was something behind Damien's inner walls. But what was it? Pain, or perhaps a secret? She knew she'd need to spend more time with him to figure it out. One morning, as she entered the office, Damien's stern expression caught her attention once again. While heading toward the large meeting room in the middle of the office, she received a message from him. "I want to see the CEO this afternoon. Be there at the meeting time." After reading the message, Melina realized Damien was constantly expecting more from her. She couldn't understand why someone so distant kept demanding things from her. Perhaps it was tied to his perfectionist approach to work. Like everyone else, Melina had to endure this pressure. When the clock struck 5, she headed to Damien's office. As she stepped inside, his eyes carried their usual cold expression. Sitting across from his desk, Melina met his gaze as he asked, "Have you reviewed the reports?" This time though his tone wasn't as harsh as before. There seemed to be a slight shift. "Yes, I've checked them all," Melina replied, placing the report on his desk. "But if there's something else you'd like to share with me, we can talk." Damien took a deep breath and fixed his eyes on the desk. Melina was drawn to his meticulous work and the intensity he poured into it, but something was missing. There was an unending distance between them. At times she felt this distance was like an uncrossable chasm. Yet in every moment there was a glimmer of hope. Perhaps a step needed to be taken. "Melina," Damien said, pausing for a moment. "We need to talk about something. With all this intense work, some issues have come up." Melina was taken aback by his words. Damien had always been cold and distant. Now though there was a hint of unease in his eyes. "What kind of issues?" she asked. When Damien turned to face her, Melina could feel the tension radiating from him. He was trying to mask his anger, but the lines on his face made her take a step back inwardly. "I was surprised when I heard some things about you," he said slowly but firmly. Melina didn't know what to say for a moment. "I don't know what you've heard, but there might be misunderstandings. I'm just trying to do my job." Damien locked eyes with her. "But it's not just about the job. When you work with me, there needs to be distance. That's how I want it. Because if we get too close, things get messy. For me, if emotions cross that distance, everything falls apart." After hearing this, Melina felt something break inside her. Perhaps traumas from his past were what made him so rigid. But she also sensed there was more to Damien's fearfulness. He was hiding something, but what? "Damien," she said, trying to steady the quiver in her voice. "No matter how distant you are, emotions always exist between people. I'm not trying to get close to you, I just want to support your work. But your harshness, it really puts me in a difficult spot." Damien fell silent for a long time. His expression hinted at an emotion about to erupt. This time though, Melina knew she had to see just how strong his inner walls were. She decided to take a step closer to him. There had to be a reason for someone to be this guarded. "Damien, if something in your past made you this way, I could help you with it," she said, her eyes filled with compassion and understanding. "Everyone has a past. But burying your emotions only isolates you more." Damien paused, looking at her. Then taking a deep breath, he said, "I don't want you to understand this. I really don't want you to understand." The sadness in his voice tugged at Melina's heart. In that moment she realized breaking through Damien's emotional barriers wouldn't be easy. Everything she knew about him was hidden behind a secret. And she resolved to uncover what that secret was. When Melina left Damien's office, her mind was a whirlwind of emotions. The coldness she'd felt in their conversation wrapped around something inside her, yet it had also awakened something new. For so long she'd been trying to decipher what lay behind Damien's mask, but perhaps there was a reason for such a deep distance. Something was hidden beneath it all. Yet in that moment, another question arose in Melina's heart. If Damien ever let that mask slip, what would happen to him? As she stepped inside and began preparing for the CEO meeting, her thoughts were consumed by Damien. The more she thought about him, the more she could feel his pain. For someone to be so guarded, there must have been a profound fracture in his past. But Melina didn't dare delve into that pain. Lost in these thoughts, a new message arrived at the office. "I'll be out this evening. I'll only be here for essential work." It was from Damien. For a moment Melina didn't know what to do. The confusion within her crashed down once again. Then she wondered if maybe she should give Damien another chance. She couldn't tell if the timing was right by listening to her feelings. But she'd sensed something, perhaps all it took was one step forward. That evening, Melina returned to Damien's office with a stack of paperwork. When she knocked on the door, Damien was at his desk, seated in his familiar posture. His eyes were lost among the papers, but this time, Melina saw something different in them. There was a softness there, as if one of his walls had retreated slightly. "You're here," Damien said, his voice gentler than usual. "Is the work finished?" Melina set aside the tense atmosphere from the morning and responded calmly. "Yes, everything's done. But there's something important I'd like to discuss, Damien." Damien looked up at her. For a moment he searched her eyes for a question, but he said nothing, simply focusing on her. I haven't said this before, Melina continued, the unease still audible in her voice. But I've noticed something. When I work with you, there's always a distance, not just professionally but emotionally too. And it's making things harder for both of us. Damien remained silent for a long time. The silence was so profound that Melina could almost hear the storm raging inside him. Something had shifted in his eyes, but she couldn't quite grasp what it was. Melina, he said at last, a softness in his tone. Do you understand me? Emotions feel like a burden. Dealing with them has always been a struggle. But this, talking so deeply, it's hard for me. Melina stepped closer and looked into his eyes carefully. But aren't we human? We live with our emotions. Beyond everything, we all have a past. Suppressing them so much won't take you anywhere else, Damien. Damien held her gaze for a few seconds without breaking away. Then, I haven't made peace with my past. That's why I run from everything, he said, his voice breaking this time. Melina, I can't get closer to you. It'll only hurt you more. Seeing Damien's vulnerability and feeling his pain touched Melina deeply. Yet at the same time, his retreat behind those walls began to draw her in even more intensely. She no longer knew what to do. But one thing was certain. She wanted to save Damien, to give him a chance. Damien, maybe it's not too late. Maybe we should take another step, together, she said, her voice carrying a resolute tone. As Damien watched her, he struggled for a moment to suppress the emotions within him. But the crack in his eyes seemed to say something. Melina, unable to bear those eyes any longer, wanted to approach him with the hope that things could be different. Maybe it should be with you. Maybe we shouldn't let more time pass before starting, she said, taking a deep breath under Damien's cold yet slightly softened gaze. In that moment, Melina realized that taking one more step toward Damien could be the greatest change in both their lives. When Melina left Damien's office that evening, the unease inside her refused to fade. His words, the fragility in his voice, and the way he seemed different from usual had both captivated and deeply affected her. In that moment she felt everything needed to fall into place. Perhaps the tension between them wasn't just an obstacle. Maybe it was also an opportunity to understand each other better. The next day, after the bustle of the office, Melina decided to call Damien. Her thoughts still hadn't settled. There had been a silence swirling around him for so long. Like everyone else, Melina was searching for answers, but predicting what Damien might say felt nearly impossible. Still, she wanted to find those answers. After a few seconds of silence on the other end of the line, Damien spoke. What's wrong, Melina? His voice was softer than usual this time. I'd like to talk about something today, Melina said, her tone resolute yet hesitant. I want to share what I've been thinking about you. Maybe it's time we're completely open with each other. Damien stayed quiet for a while at her suggestion. He knew how challenging such a deep conversation would be for both of them. But then slowly he said, All right. Come, let's talk. Hours later, when Melina stepped into Damien's office, the familiar cold atmosphere was still there. This time, though, she felt it was time to break through those walls. She walked toward Damien and sat at his desk. Looking into his eyes, she saw the usual indecision, but also a man on the verge of unraveling. Damien, she said, her voice trembling slightly. There's something I want to say. Maybe I don't understand you fully, maybe I can't figure you out completely, but I want to see you up close. I want you to be with me. Not just in a work relationship, emotionally too. I want this because I want to know you better. Damien saw both unease and sincerity in Melina's eyes. For a moment, his defenses threatened to rise again, but he realized he didn't want to stop her from stepping toward him. He'd built walls for so long that opening up to someone, trusting them, felt incredibly difficult. Yet Melina's words were starting to change something. Melina, he said, taking a deeper breath, my feelings for you are complicated. I don't know what I want. But I don't want to hurt you. Because every moment I spend with you feels different. But my old wounds, the pain inside me, they pull me back, hold me still. Melina fell into a deep silence after his words. Her eyes caught a fracture, a pain in Damien's gaze. Damien, your past may have shaped who you are now. But we can't change the past. There's only the present. A place where we can be together. And if you let me, I can be with you. I don't want to leave you alone anymore. Damien focused intently on every word she said. The barriers inside him were melting bit by bit. But facing his past was no easy task. The loss of his mother, the fears of his childhood, everything had left a deep scar. Melina's direct approach brought up yet another emotional hurdle. "Melina," he said, "you can't understand me. For me, talking about this, even seeing the pain I've lived through, is a burden. Being with me will only hurt you more. You've always been a determined, strong woman. But maybe being with me will damage you." Melina felt a pang in her heart at his words. Yet she also knew that getting closer to him, understanding him more, could be a solution. With patience and trust, they could overcome the obstacles between them. "I can face this with you," she said patiently. "Your past, the way I know you, it's what made you who you are, but we can change. Together we can be stronger. I want you to be with me, Damien. I'm telling you this because I accept you as you are." Damien closed his eyes for a moment. Melina's deeply sincere words shook him even more. Someone approaching him so genuinely made him feel even more vulnerable. But he wanted to be with Melina, to truly trust her. Yet it felt like a battle with the weight of his past. "This is so hard for me, Melina. But I don't want to lose you either," he said, his voice softening now. Melina stepped closer. "Then we can take a step together. Let's live in the moment without getting lost in the shadow of your past. Being together, getting closer, it'll be good for us." Damien thought for a moment. Then he looked at Melina and smiled faintly. For the first time there was genuine trust in his eyes. "Maybe you're right. Maybe I've been alone and afraid for too long. But now maybe we can overcome these barriers together." The next day, Melina noticed the silence in Damien's office. The thoughts that had lingered from the night into the early morning hours echoed in both their minds, fading into the distance. Yet that morning the familiar distance still lingered in Damien's eyes. This time, though, Melina felt she could peel back his mask just a little more. He'd been quiet for so long that she now believed something had to change. As she opened the door to his office, she realized she couldn't wait for Damien to set aside his solitary thoughts and hear her out. She was going through a tough time herself, but she wanted to understand him better and support him. They both knew by now how important it was to stand by each other. "Damien," Melina said as she stepped inside. His eyes still carried that same indecision, but she decided to take another step forward. "We need to do something together. Staying this far apart isn't good for either of us." Damien looked up at her words and studied her carefully. Yet there was still a distance in his gaze. The walls he'd built inside himself continued to hold his emotions at bay. After a few seconds of silence, he said somewhat uncertainly, "What should we do? We need to get closer to each other. We'll keep the past behind us. I want to be by your side right now, not just in this room but truly taking steps toward each other," Melina said with conviction. Damien took a deep breath. The jealousy and fears within him echoed in his mind all at once. "But Melina, being with me will put you in a tough spot. My past will affect you." Melina took a few more steps toward him and said with courage, "Your past brought you to today. But now we can create a future together. We have to do this, Damien. Not erase the past but try to be together despite it." As Damien lifted his head to look at her, he saw her sincerity. His fears began to melt slowly, and Melina's reassuring gaze told him something different. Maybe she was right. Maybe it was time to set his fears aside and start trusting. But his past was so dark that her ease in trusting him felt strange. For a moment he felt the light in her eyes, and it forced him to confront the darkness within himself. "It won't be that easy, Melina," Damien said, the hardness in his voice fading gradually. "My past. I'll have to share it with you, won't I?" Melina gave him a brave smile and nodded. "Yes, because I accept you as you are, Damien. We can carry the burdens together." Damien paused for a moment. Then, without breaking eye contact, he said, "I've always been alone, Melina. I never trusted anyone because no one truly understood me. It'll be hard for you to understand, but you should try." After those words he fell silent again. Melina stepped closer. Dealing with a man tangled in such complex emotions wasn't easy. But both of them were willing to face the struggle. "It'll be tough. But we can do it together," she said, reaffirming her trust in him. Damien stayed quiet for a while. Then slowly he said, "All right then, let's do it together." Those words marked the first step toward overcoming his inner barriers. Their relationship grew closer with each passing day. Yet there had been tense moments between Melina and Damien. While Melina wanted to break down his walls, the difficulties of the process sometimes left her more strained. His past and its shadows made their growing closeness a challenge. But one thing was certain: they both felt something for each other. One evening after leaving Damien's office, Melina decided to head to a cafe. She wanted some time alone to gather her thoughts. Amid the chaos of that day, there was still a side of Damien he hadn't revealed. He wanted to understand what it was. A bit more reflection was needed to pull herself out of these emotional waves. As she sat alone in the cafe, a message popped up on her phone. It was from Damien. "Melina, I've been thinking about our talks this morning. We should spend more time together. We may not forget the past, but we need to leave it behind. Would you like to go out for dinner tonight?" Melina smiled as she read the message. Damien's openness showed he was truly starting to trust her. In that moment, the fear in her heart slipped away, and the idea of spending more time with him warmed her inside. After accepting Damien's invitation, Melina felt excited about the dinner. In that moment she sensed she could fully trust him. Spending time together would be an emotional outlet for both of them. Yet that morning Melina had been a little anxious. Knowing everything was on the right track could sometimes feel even more challenging. The traces of the past could leave deep wounds in relationships. When Melina arrived at the office, she thought she didn't need to be as formal with Damien as he might expect. She knew that keeping her distance as she had before wouldn't benefit their relationship. Today she decided she truly needed to take a step forward. As the hour approached dinner time, Damien was waiting for her at the restaurant he'd invited her to. The tension between them had slowly faded since the last time they'd seen each other. In Damien's gaze, Melina could feel that things were one step closer. At that table, instead of surface-level strain, there was a deeper connection. When Melina entered the restaurant, Damien was seated in the middle of the table, offering her a serious yet warm smile. She observed his demeanor. Until now he'd been distant and cold toward her. But tonight everything felt different. There was a change in his eyes, a sense of trust mixed with a slight hint of worry. Melina noticed the turmoil he was experiencing, but she sat down, trusting him. "Welcome, Melina," Damien said, smiling. Melina returned the gesture. "Good to be here," she replied, taking a deep breath. "Today feels different, doesn't it?" Damien locked eyes with her. "Yes, it does feel different. But I don't know where this difference will lead," he said. He took a sip of water and looked at her again. "You're putting me in a tough spot, Melina." With a faint smile, Melina responded, "Being in a tough spot can sometimes be the best way to take a step forward. You shouldn't just live in fear." Damien met her words with a brief silence. Every word she spoke was breaking down his inner walls. Yet escaping the shadow of his past wasn't easy. In that moment, Melina asked him the biggest question on her mind. "Damien, I know your past has affected you deeply. But I've thought I could trust you. I really want to do this. Still something feels missing. Are you ready to face your past?" Damien lowered his head. Hearing that question was harder for him than anything else. But eventually he answered slowly, "Sometimes facing the past is terrifying. But losing you isn't any less frightening than hiding it." Melina saw the fear inside him. Over time she'd come to understand how hard it was for him to trust. It wasn't just a physical distance, it was an emotional barrier. Yet she was determined to step further into his inner world to get to know him. "Your past shouldn't stop me from understanding you," she said, her eyes shining. "I trust you. I just want you to trust me too." Damien hesitated, his gaze unwavering. Then softly he said, "I do trust you. And maybe we should explore this together. The past, the future, maybe getting to know you." In that moment they both felt a connection so strong it was as if everything between them was slowly coming into light. Their future depended solely on trusting each other and moving forward together. But Melina still felt like a stranger to Damien's past. So she waited for him to open up. During dinner, Damien seemed more at ease than usual. The moments he smiled felt like a victory in his battle against the darkness within. Being with Melina gave him strength. But how lasting that would be remained to be seen. After the meal, Damien gently took Melina's hand. "Thank you so much, Melina," he said. "What you said to me today, it meant a lot." Melina held his hands in return. "This is just the beginning. We'll understand everything better together, Damien." They stepped out of the restaurant together. Melina walked slowly, reflecting on the night. She felt things were about to get even more complex. Every step forward would hinge on how much they could leave the dark memories of the past behind. But one thing was certain. Together they could overcome anything. After their last evening together, Melina had managed to set aside her inner restlessness. No matter how complicated things got, both she and Damien wanted to spend more time together. Trusting each other wasn't just about words. It had to show in their actions too. Yet Melina knew Damien's past could still be a barrier. Overcoming those obstacles completely would take time and patience. Still, her sense of trust grew stronger with each passing day. That morning, as she stepped into the office, she realized she'd been waiting for the right moment to approach Damien. It was no longer just a working relationship. It was time to show they could truly rely on each other. But everything could change in an instant, she thought. Slowly, she headed toward Damien's office. Damien was busy at his desk, engrossed in documents. When Melina entered, his eyes flicked to her briefly before returning to his papers. For a moment, as she watched him, she wondered why he still kept such a distance. But then Damien looked up, a hint of indecision in his gaze. "Melina," he said after a few seconds. "We have an important meeting today. Are you ready?" Without waiting for his response, Melina replied, "Yes, but first we need to talk about something." Damien watched her closely, and Melina encountered a demeanor she hadn't seen from him before. In that moment, her eyes held trust, courage, and a touch of apprehension. Something had shifted. She didn't just want to talk about work. She wanted to take an emotional step forward. Damien took a deep breath. "What do you want to talk about?" Studying his hesitant demeanor more carefully, Melina said, "I want to talk about us getting closer. It's time we took that step. We need to leave the past behind. We should be stronger together." Damien gazed at her for a while. Though he struggled to fully grasp the meaning of her words, they shed a kind of light on him. He still feared the shadows of his past. But being with Melina was so valuable that even though it was hard to accept, they had begun to trust each other. "Melina, sharing my past with you isn't easy. But I need to tell you something," he said slowly. "My past is still with me, but when I'm with you I feel so strong that sometimes I even forget its burdens." Melina approached him slowly. "We can overcome this together," she said. "Remembering the past might be hard, but we're here together right now. I trust you, Damien." Damien stepped toward her, keeping his eyes on hers. Softly he said, "I really want this, Melina. Being together, it's changing everything for me." After that conversation, their relationship began to enter a new phase. Despite the scars of the past, they worked to strengthen their trust in each other. But there was still a journey ahead, one that could be just as challenging for both of them. The more time they spent together, the more they felt the weight of that past. As they prepared to head to the meeting, Damien glanced at Melina. "Just so you know, our focus right now is a business meeting. So maybe we should save the emotional talks for later, right?" he said with a slight smile. Melina smiled back. "Yes, of course," she replied, but her sense of trust remained unshaken. They were emotionally closer now. They understood each other's vulnerabilities better. An hour later, Melina and Damien attended a meeting with the company president. Yet Melina felt her closeness to Damien even more. This connection wasn't just professional, it was strengthening their personal bond too. After the meeting, Damien indicated he wanted to have a private conversation with her. In that moment she realized how different things could become. "I need to talk to you today," Damien said before dinner. "After the meeting, I want you to know what I'm really thinking." "Melina, Every moment I spend with you is reshaping my life. But I still haven't figured out how to fully approach this. Melina approached him calmly. I think everything will get better with time. We can overcome the obstacles from the past together, Damien. We can do this. Damien felt his trust in Melina deepen a little more. Her words gave him courage. Then maybe starting today we'll explore a different path together. Melina and Damien's relationship deepened with each passing day. They had begun to trust each other, but the effects of the past still posed a significant barrier. Melina tried to understand the emotional turmoil Damien was caught in and the reasons he'd spent years building his walls. Yet getting close to him sometimes felt like taking a step back. They needed to navigate those moments with patience and trust. One day they stumbled upon a new discovery about Damien's past. Melina unexpectedly met one of his childhood friends, someone who knew more about Damien's lost years. Wanting to understand him better, Melina decided to have a calm conversation with this friend. Damien never really wanted to share his truths with anyone for years. He stayed alone, the old friend said while recounting details to Melina. But he's still strong. When he realized we didn't want to leave him so isolated, he might have thought it was already too late. After hearing this, Melina decided to confront Damien again. She had grasped how deep his past traumas ran. In that moment she realized their relationship was about much more than two people caring for each other. It was about two individuals being open and honest, truly understanding one another. Something far greater. So she knew she had to tell Damien the truth. That evening she called him. Damien, I've learned something. I want to face your past. We need to take another step together. Damien answered the call with some hesitation. Whenever you're ready, Melina. But first we need to figure out how much we can handle my past. After that conversation, Melina felt she could fully trust Damien. Together they would overcome everything. A week later, the two of them began talking more about Damien's past. Slowly, Melina helped him confront the pain of his history while they worked to build their trust in each other completely. It was a challenging journey, but with the confidence they had in one another, Melina and Damien felt ready to face it together. Over time, the relationship between Damien and Melina had transformed completely. They had started to understand each other's wounds, vulnerabilities, and pasts more deeply. As they carried the burdens of the past together, their bond grew even stronger. Challenges still lingered, but they were far more resilient in facing them as a team. With every conversation, Melina realized she was truly getting to know who Damien was. The pain of the past had created an opportunity for them to move beyond it. When they were by each other's side, they felt ready to confront any hardship life threw their way. One day, Damien took a step toward Melina. His eyes held determination and emotion. Melina, I want to tell you something, he said, looking into her eyes. I know we can overcome anything together. I want to look toward the future with you. Hearing those words, Melina felt how deeply her trust in him had grown. With each passing day, what existed between them was no longer just a professional connection. It was genuine love and trust. I feel the same way, Damien. Let's start anew together. And in that moment, Melina and Damien fully built their trust in each other. The barriers of the past and their fears fell behind them. Now together they were ready to create a happy future. A year later, Damien and Melina's relationship had grown even stronger. They had healed from the wounds of the past and drawn closer to each other. The projects they worked on together had succeeded, and both had taken significant strides in their personal and professional lives. They now had a much clearer vision of their future. One evening, Damien and Melina came together in a tall building overlooking the city. Their eyes reflected nothing but trust and love. They looked at each other and Melina smiled. We did it together, she said. And now, everything's going to be even more beautiful. Damien took Melina's hands and replied, Yes, we overcame everything together. Our future is in our hands now. Filled with the joy of trusting each other and starting anew, they stood side by side. The pains of the past had only made them stronger. Together they had surmounted every obstacle and were finally stepping toward a happy future. She pulled herself together, returned to her desk, and within minutes began preparing her presentation. This was her chance to prove herself in this new world by this man's side. Beyond the coffee incident and those tense glares, the strong woman within Melina was beginning to emerge.